The negotiation was over. The sky over the Jordan Valley was starting to turn a bruised, lethal purple, the color of a closing eye. Abraham had pleaded for 10 righteous men to save a civilization. But in a city where cruelty was the only currency, heaven couldn't even find a handful. We like to think of Sodom as a distant myth of fire and brimstone. We're wrong. Its streets looked exactly like the one outside your window right now, filled with wealth, wonder, and a pride so loud drowned out the scent of sulfur on the breeze. They were partying in towers of ivory and glass, convinced their progress made them gods, unaware that while they were chasing the next thrill, the mercy of the Almighty had already left the building. This isn't a story about ancient ruins. It's a warning about what happens when the salt of the earth loses its savor, and the fire finally answers. Sodom wasn't a wasteland of dust. It was a lush mirage that made travelers weep with envy at its emerald fields. It stood as a golden monument in the valley of the Jordan, looking more like the garden of the Lord than a city of men. Up on ivory balconies, a merchant sips wine from a heavy golden chalice, aged in the deep cellars of the elite, looking down with godlike indifference at the desperate bustle below. He doesn't see the dirt, only the glitter of his own success, convinced this empire is eternal. But this abundance wasn't a blessing. It was a thick, golden shroud draped over a festering depravity that no one dared to acknowledge. In Sodom, cruelty was the only currency that never lost its value in the harsh midday sun. Sin wasn't hidden in the dark. It was traded openly in the market, with the elite calling their depravity progress, while the poor withered under their feet. The city had turned from every path of justice, trading the soul for a handful of silver and a moment of forbidden's flesh. This was a society where violence wasn't an event. It was the very oxygen they breathed, a heavy rhythm of oppression they celebrated as true freedom. Sodom had become a machine of malice, so efficient and so comfortable that its inhabitants had completely forgotten they were mortal. This was the sin of the plain. They were arrogant, overfed, and completely unconcerned with the cries of the broken. The prophet Ezekiel would later describe a civilization that possessed everything but lacked a single ounce of human conscience. Instead of songs of praise, their streets echoed with the hypnotic, grinding noise of mockery and unfiltered, predatory lust. Marble monuments were built to a glory that was already rotting from the inside as they ignored the suffering at their gates. They were so busy worshiping their own reflection that they missed the sound of the universe finally shifting gears. It wasn't the sound of thunder yet, but the agonizing outcry of the oppressed was beginning to shake the foundations of reality. It was the sound of 1,000 whispers of the broken, vibrating against the throne of God until heaven's silence was finally shattered. This wasn't a local grievance. It was a moral emergency that triggered a gravity no economy could ever fix. Prosperity had become a silent killer, numbing the pain of the victims while masking the growing stench of the killers. The countdown had already started in the hidden realms, even as the music grew louder and the wine grew sweeter. Far above the heavy smoke of their altars and the grease of their endless banquets, God decided to descend and see if the cancer had reached the point of no return. He wasn't coming with an army or a flood, but with a terrifyingly focused attention on the hearts of every man in that valley. He needed to know if there was a single spark of mercy left in a city that had become a masterpiece of human cruelty. The stage was set for a divine judgment that would redefine the meaning of the word apocalypse for all of human history. But before the fire could fall, a man of dust would dare to stand in the way and begin the ultimate intercession. While Sodom was busy celebrating its own invincibility, the heat of the day brought a different kind of visitor to the oaks of Mamre. Abraham sat in the shade of his tent, the air thick with the smell of dry earth and the weight of a divine appointment he didn't even know he had. Looking up, he saw 3 men standing nearby, 3 figures, appearing out of the shimmering desert heat like a mirage made of flesh and bone. This wasn't just a chance encounter. It was the Creator himself stepping into the timeline to conduct a forensic audit of human depravity. The patriarch didn't hesitate for a single second, instinctively knowing that these were no ordinary travelers passing through his lands. He ran from the entrance of his tent to meet them, bowing low to the ground in a display of radical, ancient hospitality. "My lord," he pleaded, "if I have found favor in your eyes, do not pass your servant by," offering water for their feet and rest under the tree. This was the absolute antithesis of the culture in the valley below, where the stranger was a target and the vulnerable were prey. Abraham rushed to prepare a feast, commanding the best bread and a choice calf to be served to his heavenly guests. He stood by them while they ate, a humble servant in the presence of a judgment that was about to shake the world. As the meal ended, the atmosphere shifted from hospitality to the cold, hard reality of the mission that brought heaven to earth. The Lord turned to Abraham with a chilling revelation. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah had become too great to ignore any longer. Their sin was described as grievous, a spiritual debt that had finally come due after centuries of ignored warnings and wasted mercy. "I will go down to see if they have done according to the outcry that has come to me," the Lord declared. It was a terrifying promise of divine presence, where the light of truth would soon expose every dark corner of the plains apocalypse. The two angels turned and headed toward the gates of the city, leaving Abraham standing alone before the Lord in the cooling shadows. A heavy silence fell over the oak groves of Mamre, a kind of silence that precedes a tectonic shift in the history of a nation. Abraham knew what was at stake. His own nephew, Lot, was breathing the toxic air of that city, his life hanging by a fraying thread. He felt the weight of the coming fire, the smell of burning sulfur already echoing in the spiritual nostrils of a man who knew God as heart. It was here, in the dust of Canaan, that the man of dust began the most audacious intercession ever recorded in Scripture. He stepped forward, his heart trembling with a mixture of holy fear and desperate, protective courage for a people who didn't even know they were doomed. Abraham didn't start by begging for pity. He started by appealing to the very character of the one who holds the stars in place. "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" he asked, throwing the challenge of justice back at the judge of all the earth. He was fighting for a city that hated him, trying to hold back the tide of an inevitable judgment with nothing but his words. This was the beginning of the great auction of life, a high-stakes negotiation where the price of 1,000,000 souls was about to be drastically slashed. He stepped into the gap, his voice a mix of gravel and grace as he challenged the heavens. He started the auction at 50, a bold number for a city that hadn't seen a righteous act in decades. "Will you sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" He pressed, his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird. He was testing the very fabric of divine mercy, trying to find the exact point where patience turns into a final judgment. The judge of all the earth listened, his silence more terrifying than any thunder, as he agreed to spare the whole place for 50. But Abraham knew the rod of the plain was deeper than any surface-level prayer could ever hope to reach. He began to haggle with the Almighty, his words a desperate intercession. They felt like walking on a razor's edge. 45, 40, 30. Every drop in the count, the air in the oak grove seemed to grow thinner and colder. He was stripping away the layers of Sodom's depravity, searching for a core of goodness that might not even exist. Each time, the Lord answered with a patience that chilled the bone, promising safety for the sake of the few. The count dropped to 20, and then, with a voice barely above a whisper, Abraham reached the final threshold, 10. It was a terrifyingly small number for a civilization that boasted such vast wealth and a sprawling, progressive population. "For the sake of 10, I will not destroy it," the Lord declared, closing the ledger on the most high-stakes negotiation in history. Abraham dared not ask for more, his heart heavy with the realization that even 10 might be an impossible find. He returned to his tent, looking toward the valley where the sun was setting on a world that had no idea its life was being auctioned. Down in the valley, The shadow of the coming apocalypse was lengthening, but the music in the streets only got louder. The people of Sodom were busy counting their silver and chasing their shadows, completely unaware of the spiritual math that had just failed them. They didn't know that their entire future was resting on the shoulders of 10 ghost-like figures who were nowhere to be found. The grace period was over, and the invisible clock was now ticking toward a midnight that would have no following dawn. The Lord departed, and the two angels turned their faces toward the city gates, carrying the fire of heaven in their eyes. The audit was moving from the high ground of intercession to the front lines of the depravity itself. As the sky turned a bruised, violent purple, the two messengers approached the gates where Lot sat in the seat of power. They weren't there to negotiate anymore. They were there to witness the final evidence of a culture that had outrun its own forgiveness. Lot saw them and rose, his instincts screaming that these strangers were a threat to the city's dark status quo. He didn't realize that by opening his door to them, he was about to trigger the very explosion that would tear the world apart. The angels enter Sodom at twilight, finding Lot sitting at the gate, a man trying to balance holy roots with a godless lifestyle. He begs them to stay in his house, knowing the city square at night is a hunting ground for the predators of the plain. The guests initially refuse, but Lot's urgent insistence reveals a terrifying truth. In Sodom, hospitality has been replaced by a primal, violent hunger. They enter his home, but the safety of the walls is a frail illusion in a city where the law of the mob rules supreme. Before they could even rest, a wave of human noise hit the house, a heavy rhythm of feet and fists beating against the wood. The men of Sodom, from the youngest to the oldest, surrounded the building with a demand that they made the very air turn cold. They didn't want conversation. They wanted to know the visitors, a euphemism for the violent sexual assault that defined their ultimate depravity. This wasn't just a riot. It was a total collapse of human empathy, a machine of malice finally revealing its jagged, predatory teeth. Lot stepped outside, desperately trying to reason with the unreasonable, offering his own daughters to the mob in a moment of absolute moral failure. It was a tragic reflection of how the city's toxic atmosphere had warped even the hearts of those who claimed to follow God. The crowd only grew angrier, lunging at him with a bloodlust that proved the time for mercy had finally reached its expiration date. They were seconds away from tearing the house down when the messengers of heaven decided to show the true meaning of apocalypse. With a sudden, blinding flash, the angels struck the mob with a darkness that no lamp could pierce, leaving them groping at the walls. The screaming changed from lust to panic, the sounds of a failed civilization stumbling in a night that would never end for them. The angels turned to Lot, their eyes now cold with the weight of the coming judgment, and told him to gather his family. The outcry had been verified, the evidence was absolute, and the sky was already preparing to deliver its final fiery verdict on the plain. Lot ran through the fading darkness to warn his daughter's suitors, his voice trembling with the weight of the coming fire. To these men of Sodom, the idea of divine judgment was nothing more than a bad joke, a laughable and absurd delusion. They lived in a world so confident in its wickedness that the thought of consequences felt both scientifically and socially impossible. Their laughter echoed in the empty streets, the final sound of a generation that mocked the very door of their own salvation. As the first gray light of dawn touched the Jordan Valley, the angels urged Lot to flee for his very life. "Hurry, take your wife and daughters, or be swept away in the punishment of this city." Their voices cut through the air, but Lot lingered, a man paralyzed by the heavy, invisible chains of a life he had built in the heart of the darkness. He was caught in the trap of normalcy, the dangerous anesthetic that whispers that tomorrow is guaranteed and judgment is a fairy tale. This hesitation wasn't just fear. It was a soul-deep attachment to the luxury, the status, and the depravity of the plain. Even with the smell of sulfur beginning to taint the breeze, part of him was still rooted in the rotting soil of Sodom. The city's toxic influence had become a part of his identity. making the path to safety feel like a journey into exile. He stood in the shadow of the apocalypse, unable to move, while the invisible clock of mercy finally struck its absolute zero. In a final, forceful act of mercy, the angels seized Lot and his family by the hands and dragged them toward the gate. God remembered Abraham's intercession, forcing a rescue on a man who was too broken and too distracted to save himself. They were pulled from the fire, not because they were righteous, but because the Lord's patience had one last exhale left. They crossed the threshold as the sun rose, leaving behind the only world they knew for a mountain they didn't yet trust. The sun crests the horizon, casting a final deceptive gold over the lush gardens of the Jordan Valley. For a few seconds, it feels like any other morning, a quiet pause before the city's depravity wakes up. But the sky doesn't hold its blue. It turns a violent, bruised purple as the very air begins to vibrate. The deadline has arrived, and the invisible clock that governed their mercy has officially stopped its ticking. Then, the heavens break open, raining down fire and burning sulfur in a storm of absolute divine judgment. This wasn't weather. It was a total geological apocalypse, as if the sun had fallen directly onto their heads. Buildings crumble like sand, and the fertile fields that once fed their pride erupt into a sea of liquid flame. The laughter that filled the streets for centuries is cut off instantly by a roar that shakes the earth as foundation. Everything in the valley, homes, gardens, livestock, and a million dreams of tomorrow is wiped away in a heartbeat. There is no rich or poor anymore. Only the screams of a people who realized their freedom was a tomb. The smoke rises like a furnace, a dark monument to a civilization that thought it could outrun the Creator. God remembered Abraham's intercession, but the city itself had become a cancer that only fire could truly cauterize. Priorities shift in a microsecond as the expensive silks melt and the gold coins are dropped in the boiling mud. The political arguments and the mockery evaporate, replaced by the terrifying realization that the warning was real all along. They looked to the mountains, clawing for a safety they spent their entire lives mocking and spitting upon. But as the fire consumes the plain, one figure in the fleeing group isn't looking toward the mountains at all. Flee to the mountains. The angel's command echoed as the horizon behind them dissolved into an apocalypse. Lot and his family ran for their lives, their shadows stretched thin by the blinding light of the falling fire. The heat of the destruction burned their skin, a terrifying reminder that the era of patience was finally over. But as they neared the safe ground, one of them felt the crushing weight of everything left behind. Lot's wife faltered, her heart still tethered to the golden halls and the familiar depravity of the plain. She wasn't just checking the horizon. She was grieving for a culture that had traded its soul for silver. The pull of the city was stronger than the promise of the mountain, a fatal choice made in a heartbeat. She turned her eyes back toward the smoke, breaking the divine seal of her only path to survival. Fine grains of salt creep across her skin like a sudden crystalline frost in the rising morning heat. Her arms stiffen into a permanent, tragic reaching pose as the human warmth is drained from her body. Her feet grow heavy, rooting her deep into the ash-covered ground as she transforms into a silent monument. All at once, she becomes a pillar of salt, a statue frozen forever in a moment of lethal longing. God's mercy had physically pulled her from the fire, but it couldn't reach a heart that looked back. Despite Abraham's desperate intercession, she chose the graveyard of the plain over the life of the mountain. She stands as a warning of the judgment that falls on those who love their cages more than freedom. The valley was now a silent tomb, marked only by a pillar of salt and the drifting white ash. Sodom's smoke cleared, but the ghost of the city haunts the headlines of our own morning news. We see the same patterns of depravity, protected as freedom, and arrogance, praised as high confidence today. Nations once shaped by biblical values are now dancing on the very same red line of divine judgment. The sexual confusion and the greedy applause for ambition are just modern echoes of an ancient, failed empire. We build higher towers and louder music, thinking our technology has somehow made us immune to the apocalypse. But the judge of all the earth hasn't changed his mind about the weight of human cruelty or pride. He watches as prayer is mocked and evil is paraded, waiting to see if any heart will dare to turn. The fire that fell was a plea across time, a terrifying signal for every city and family to finally wake up. In a world that closely mirrors Sodom's corruption, choosing to follow the narrow path can feel lonely and uncool. People might call you boring or old-fashioned, but the crowd in the plain followed their pride straight into the flames. Standing firm in the truth is a silent intercession, a way to shine as a light in a culture obsessed with shadows. We are called to resist the pull of the majority, knowing that the broad road leads only to a sudden, silent end. Even now, the Lord is slow to anger and abounding in love, holding back the storm for the sake of the few. Mercy is still extended to those who repent and seek refuge in the only rock that can withstand the heat. But make no mistake, God will not leave the guilty unpunished, and the clock of his patience is ticking toward zero. The sky ran out of forgiveness for Sodom once, and the evidence suggests that the next storm is already gathering its strength. The smoke of Sodom isn't just a historical shadow. It's a mirror for the reflection, staring back from our own screens. We are building cities out of glass and arrogance, convinced that our modern freedom has somehow outpaced the eternal moral law. But righteousness still exalts a nation, and the rot of the heart remains a disgrace that fire eventually finds and consumes. Don't to let the noise of your own success drown out the warning that has been vibrating through the centuries for your sake. If the fire fell tonight, what would the search of the angels find in the private rooms of your own house? Are you the salt that preserves the earth, or are you just another piece of a world that is ready to burn? We look at Lot's wife and mock her nostalgia, yet we find ourselves clinging to the same sinking ships every day. The question isn't whether God is slow to anger. It's how much time you think you actually have left to choose. There is still hope for those who are willing to turn, repent, and seek a refuge that no flame can touch. The Lord is slow to anger and abounding in love, but he will not leave the guilty unpunished forever. Choose the narrow road that leads to life, even if the crowd calls you uncool or old-fashioned for standing firm. Don't to wait for the first drop of fire to believe in the storm that is already gathering over the modern horizon. We are uncovering the raw, unfiltered truth of the Word every week to keep our eyes open while the world sleeps. If you're ready to stop following the crowd into the fire and start standing for something eternal, join this mission. Subscribe right now and hit that bell so you don't miss the next warning from the God who judges and saves. The sky is changing, be ready before the door shuts and the mercy of the Almighty finally leaves the building for good.